Many people say that people become softer with age. Well, they don't know me. I am 67, and every year I become more convinced that people are predictable and unreliable creatures, especially when it comes to money and love. I moved to Palm Desert 5 years ago after selling the construction company I had built over nearly 40 years. I wouldn't say it was my dream, a cozy bungalow overlooking the desert, where most of my neighbors are retirees like me, but it's quiet, dry, and no one bothers me. My wife Beverly died 8 years ago, and I saw no point in staying in the big house in Phoenix, where every corner reminded me of her. This morning began as usual. Sunrise in the desert is a special sight, even for a cynic like me. The purple-pink sky gradually faded to a dull blue until the sun turned it into a scorching white void. I sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee and watched my elderly neighbor Elaine walk her fat pug. She waved at me and I nodded, forcing a smile. No one expects more from me. My phone vibrated on the table, a message from Noel, my only son. "Hey, Dad, how are you doing?" "Peyton and I were thinking of coming over for the weekend," I snorted. His Peyton and I always sounded fake, as if he was trying to convince himself, not me, that they were a happy couple. Noel is 39. He inherited my tall stature and Beverly's chestnut hair, but he didn't inherit my personality at all. Too soft, too trusting. I'd spent my whole life trying to toughen him up, prepare him for the real world, but to no avail. He grew up to be a kind person, thanks to his mother, but kind people often become easy targets, especially for people like Peyton Ellington. I remember the day he brought her to our house. Still that big house in Phoenix. A thin blonde with sharp features and eyes that only smiled when she looked at Noel. For everyone else, there was only cold assessment. I recognized that look instantly. It's how people look when they're always calculating what they can get from others. Beverly was already sick at the time, but even she noticed something was wrong. "Erwin," she said to me that night, "that girl doesn't love our boy." But Noel was enchanted, and I knew that any warnings from me would only push him away. 6 months later, they announced their engagement. A year later, they were married in a modest ceremony where Peyton managed to look both like a modest bride and a princess who had descended to mere mortals. Beverly was no longer with us by then. I watched my son gaze adoringly at his bride and saw in her eyes only the reflection of wedding gifts and a new surname. When Noel asked my advice about a joint bank account, I tried to be diplomatic. "Son, maybe you should wait. Get to know each other better in marriage." He laughed. "Dad, we're not in your generation. Peyton is my wife. We are one family." His naivety was almost touching. Almost. I leaned back in my chair and took a sip of my cold coffee. Their marriage had lasted 5 years, longer than I had expected. But in recent months, I had noticed signs of a storm brewing. Noel called less often. When we did meet, he seemed tense, and Peyton seemed distracted. She often checked her phone and found excuses to leave early. Classic signs. During their last visit a month ago, I noticed her whispering something into her phone while standing in the backyard. When she saw me, she abruptly ended the conversation and put on a fake smile. "Just a colleague from work, a scheduling issue," she explained. I nodded, pretending to believe her. That same evening, when Noel went to the store to buy wine, I asked her directly, "Peyton, is everything okay with you and Noel?" She flinched but quickly pulled herself together. "Of course, Erwin. Why do you ask?" "I'm just concerned about my son. He seems tense. Just a lot of work." "You know how responsible he is." Her eyes avoided mine. "He takes after you." The last part was an obvious lie. Noel had never been like me, neither in appearance nor in character. I was calculating, always prepared for the worst. He was a dreamer who believed in the best. I built my company knowing that no one would lend a hand if you fell. He built his life on trust and honesty, believing that everyone around him was the same. The next day, I called an old acquaintance, Lenny Trout, a private investigator I had once worked with on company matters. We hadn't spoken in 10 years, but he answered as if we had seen each other yesterday. "Erwin Hope? What the hell, old man? I thought you'd been sipping cocktails on some beach for years." "I prefer the desert and whiskey, Lenny. I need your help." I explained the situation, trying to sound like a concerned father rather than a paranoid man. "You want me to keep an eye on your daughter-in-law?" There was no judgment in his voice, only professional interest. Just to make sure my fears are unfounded. Lenny whistled. That's going to cost you, especially if you have to go to Phoenix. Money's no object, I replied. Discretion is important. For the next 2 weeks, I received dry reports from him. Peyton worked as an administrator at an expensive cosmetic clinic, and her schedule was usually predictable. But twice a week, she had a 2-hour break, which she spent not at the cafe across the street, as she told her colleagues, but at a boutique hotel 2 blocks from the clinic. On the 14th day of surveillance, Lenny sent photos. Peyton was entering the hotel with a tall, dark-haired man. In the next photos, they were leaving. She was fixing her hair. He was kissing her on the cheek before they went their separate ways. His name is Reuben Kincaid, Lenny reported. He's a financial advisor who works with several of the clinic's clients. Divorced, no children, has a gambling problem. Do you want me to dig deeper? I thought about it. Part of me wanted to call Noel immediately and tell him everything. But I knew my son. He would either not believe me or forgive her. Neither would solve the problem. No, I had to do something else. Dig deeper, I replied, and keep an eye on her financial activity. I have a suspicion that suspicion was confirmed a week later when Lenny reported that Peyton had started transferring small amounts to a new account opened in her maiden name. Individually, the transfers were inconspicuous, but together they added up to a decent amount. Classic preparation for an escape. What about Kincaid, I asked. Oh, he's an interesting guy, Lenny chuckled. He's only been living under the name Reuben Kincaid for the last 3 years. Before that, he was known as Richard Kowalski. He had problems with the law in Nevada, fraud, forgery, nothing major, but enough to change his name and state. I felt my lips stretch into a cold smile. This was even better than I had expected. Lenny, I need a full dossier on this Kincaid, and keep watching both of them. Over the next few days, I developed a plan, not to save Noel's marriage, that ship was already sinking, but to teach a lesson for Peyton, a lesson for her lover, and most importantly, a lesson for my son. Life is too short to learn solely from your own mistakes. I brought Helen Weverly, an old acquaintance and one of the best family lawyers in Arizona, into the case. We prepared the documents, a retroactive prenuptial agreement that Peyton had never signed, but with a perfect forgery of her signature. Illegal? Absolutely, but effective. We also prepared statements to the police about fraud and grand theft, in case we needed to apply more pressure. All that remained was to wait for Peyton to make her move. I was sure it would happen soon. According to Lenny, she had already booked 2 tickets to the Caymans through a front man. Meanwhile, Noel continued to live in ignorance. His messages became increasingly rare and formal. The visit they had planned never happened. Peyton suddenly came down with the flu. At least that's what she told Noel. On the last day of October, around 2 in the morning, I was awakened by a phone call. I'm usually a light sleeper, but age takes its toll. It took several rings before I was fully awake. My son's name appeared on the screen. Noel. My voice was hoarse from sleep. Dad, his voice trembled as if he were crying. Dad, I need to talk to you. It's urgent. What's wrong? Not over the phone. I'm coming over. I'll be there in an hour. He hung up before I could say anything. I slowly got out of bed, feeling my knees ache. So Peyton had made her move. Earlier than I expected, but I was ready. I made coffee, took a bottle of bourbon out of the cupboard, and sat in the living room to wait. In my head, I ran through my plan, not just for the next few hours, but for the days and weeks ahead. Like pieces on a chessboard, I saw all the possible moves and outcomes. The coffee had cooled, so I poured myself a whiskey. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock on the door. Sharp, desperate. I didn't rush to open it, giving my son a moment to feel the moment. Finally, I walked to the door and threw it open. Noel stood on the threshold, pale with reddened eyes and 3 days' stubble. His gaze revealed something I had seen too often in people's eyes, shattered illusions. She's gone, he said in a hoarse voice. Dad, my wife emptied all our accounts and ran off with her lover. I stepped back silently, letting him into the house. He walked inside as if his legs could barely support the weight of the betrayal he carried on his shoulders. In the living room, he collapsed into an armchair, covering his face with his hands. I closed the door, looking thoughtfully at my son. It was time to launch the plan I had been preparing all these weeks. I took my phone out of my pocket and dialed a number I had memorized long ago. "Start the plan. Now," I said in an even voice. Noel raised his head, his confusion momentarily overcoming his grief. "What plan?" he asked. "Dad, what's going on?" I sat down across from him, pouring whiskey into 2 glasses. "Have a drink," I said, handing him one, "and I'll tell you how we're going to get your money back." And something more, I watched Noel's trembling fingers clench the whiskey glass. His hands, the hands of an engineer, accustomed to working with precise calculations and drawings, were now as unsteady as a child's. He downed the whiskey in one gulp and coughed. "My son never knew how to drink." "Tell me everything," I said, pouring him another. "From the beginning." Noel took a deep breath, trying to collect his thoughts. "I came home earlier than usual. My meeting at the site was canceled, and I decided to surprise Peyton." A bitter smile twisted his face. The surprise was definitely a success. He fell silent, staring into the amber liquid as if hoping to find answers there. The house was empty. Her things weren't in the closet. I thought maybe she decided to rearrange things or something like that. He shook his head, smiling at his own naivety. Then I noticed that some photos were missing. Her cosmetics from the bathroom. Even that stupid vase her mother gave her. I nodded silently. It was a classic pattern. Take personal items, things of sentimental value, leaving behind furniture and anything that couldn't be quickly and quietly removed. I started calling her, but her phone was turned off. Then I checked our accounts. His voice broke. "Everything's gone, Dad. Our joint account, my savings account, even the line of credit for home repairs, everything was gone. She left exactly $50 in each account, apparently so they wouldn't be closed automatically." "How much?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer from Lenny's reports. "Almost 300,000. Noel rubbed his face with his hands. "Everything I'd saved over the years. The money you gave us for the down payment on the house. Even what was left of my mother's inheritance." I felt anger rising inside me, not because of the money, but because of the mention of Beverly's inheritance. My late wife had left part of her savings to Noel, hoping he would use it to start a family. Not for some predator to take it to the Caymans with her con artist lover. "How do you know she left with a lover?" I asked, even though it was obvious. Noel smiled bitterly. "When I realized what was happening, I called the clinic where she works. I pretended I wanted to make an appointment. The administrator said Peyton had taken 2 weeks off. Then I went to see Darlene, her best friend." I snorted skeptically. I'd seen this Darlene a couple of times. She was just as calculating as Peyton. "And of course, she didn't know anything?" "Not at first." Noel took a sip of whiskey. "At first she denied it, said she had no idea where Peyton was. But when I said I was going to report her missing and the theft to the police, she got nervous. She admitted that Peyton was seeing some financier from the clinic." "Reuben," I nodded as if I was hearing the name for the first time. "How long?" "Over a year." Noel's voice was full of disbelief. "She had been living a double life for a whole year, and I hadn't noticed a thing." What an idiot I am. I suppressed the urge to agree. My son really was blind, but he didn't need my judgment right now. "And what did Darlene say about Peyton's plans?" "Nothing specific. Just that Peyton was talking about a new life and great opportunities, and that this Reuben guy is supposedly some kind of financial genius." Noel clenched his fists. "A financial genius who seduces other men's wives and helps them steal their family savings." I poured myself another whiskey and began to think aloud. So he helped her transfer the money in a way that would be difficult to trace. Perhaps through offshore accounts or cryptocurrency. Noel looked at me in surprise. "How do you know about cryptocurrency?" "You said it was all digital candy wrappers." I shrugged. I can think it's stupid and still understand how it works. Just business instinct. In fact, it wasn't instinct. 2 weeks ago, Lenny reported that Peyton and Reuben had converted some of the stolen money into bitcoins through a shady exchange in Las Vegas. The rest they transferred through shell companies to the Cayman Islands, a favorite scheme of scammers like Kincaid. I leaned back in my chair, watching my son. The pain on his face was mixed with anger, confusion, and something else. Shame. I knew that feeling. Shame not only from betrayal, but also from my own blindness. from the realization that you had been used, and you had allowed it to happen. You're not an idiot, Noel, I finally said. Just trusting, like your mother. At the mention of Beverly, his eyes filled with tears. Mom would have seen right through her, wouldn't she? She always saw people for who they really were. I nodded, remembering how Beverly had disliked Peyton from the first moment she saw her. Irwin, that girl is cold as ice, despite all her smiles. She looks at our boy like he's an ATM. Beverly was right, as always. Your mother warned me about Peyton, I admitted, even before your wedding. Noel looked up. And you kept quiet? All these years. I shrugged. What would you have done if I had told you? You were in love, blinded by her. I would have listened. No, you wouldn't, I shook my head. You would have decided that I was just a grumpy old man who didn't want to see you happy, or that I was against your choice simply because she wasn't like your mother. Noel wanted to argue, but then he softened, acknowledging that I was right. Yeah, you're probably right. I was so sure that she... He didn't finish his sentence, turning away toward the window. Dawn was breaking outside. The first rays of the desert sun painted the sky a pale pink. A new day and a new life for my son, whether he wanted it or not. I remembered how I first suspected that something was wrong with Peyton. It was in the 3rd year of their marriage during a family dinner in honor of Noel's birthday. Peyton received a message, glanced at her phone, and her face changed for a moment. Not a smile or a frown. No, something more intimate, like a secret known only to her and the sender. She excused herself and left to respond to a colleague. When she returned, her cheeks were slightly pink and her eyes were shining. Classic signs of a woman talking to someone other than a colleague. At the time, I dismissed my suspicions. After all, my son was 37, a grown man capable of dealing with his own wife. Or so I told myself. But then other signs appeared. Peyton began to stay late at work more often. She started spending weekends with friends at the spa or shopping. New clothes, new hairstyle, new perfume. The classic preparation for entering the dating market, even though she was already married. I began to notice financial irregularities as well. During one of my visits, Noel mentioned that they were now spending more on restaurants and clothes. Peyton says we need to treat ourselves sometimes. We work so hard, he explained with the smile of someone who sees no problem. But my suspicions were finally confirmed 3 months ago, when I arrived unannounced. Peyton opened the door in a silk robe, her hair disheveled, clearly not expecting guests. There were 2 glasses of wine on the coffee table. When I asked about the second glass, she unconvincingly explained that she had been video chatting with a friend and they were virtually drinking together. Complete nonsense. That same evening, when Noel drove me back to the hotel, I made the decision to hire Lenny. Dad? Noel's voice pulled me out of my memories. You said you knew how to get my money back. What did you mean? I looked closely at my son. Despite his age, at that moment he seemed like a child to me. Confused, seeking protection. But sometimes protecting means making someone stronger. Noel, what I'm about to say may seem strange, but I ask you to hear me out before you jump to conclusions. He nodded, his reddened eyes looking at me with hope, a drowning man's last straw. I knew Peyton was cheating on you, I said bluntly. I've known for several months. His face froze as if I had hit him. What? And you kept quiet? Again? Hear me out, I reminded him. I hired a private investigator, Lenny Trout, an old acquaintance who worked with me back in the company days. He followed Peyton, recorded her meetings with this Rubin guy, gathered information. Noel jumped up, knocking over his glass. You spied on my wife? On my family? What right did you have? Sit down. My voice became cold and commanding, the tone I used when I ran the company through difficult times. Sit down and listen to the end. Surprisingly, he obeyed. Maybe it was a habit from childhood, or maybe he just didn't have the strength to resist. I wasn't just following her. I was gathering evidence. Photos, recordings, financial reports. Everything that might be useful if it goes to court, I paused, and I gathered information about her lover. This Reuben Kincaid isn't who he says he is. Interest flashed in Noel's eyes. What do you mean? His real name is Richard Kowalski. 3 years ago, he changed his name and moved from Nevada, where he had problems with the law. Fraud, forgery, nothing major, but enough to ruin his reputation as a financial genius. Noel listened with his mouth open. But how? Why? Why did I do all this? I smiled faintly. Because I'm your father. And I always have a plan in case something goes wrong. Always I stood up and walked over to the bookcase, taking out a thin folder. Here are copies of everything Lenny collected. The originals are in a safe place. Here is the evidence of their connection, financial fraud, Kincaid's past, enough to take them to court or to the police. Noel took the folder with trembling hands and began to look through its contents. His face changed with every page. Disbelief gave way to anger, then shock, and finally something I rarely saw in my son, cold determination. They went to Maui with my money, he said, looking at the photos of Peyton and Ruben on the beach. Last year when she said she was going to a cosmetology seminar. I nodded. That vacation was one of the first red flags Lenny noticed. And here, Noel turned the page, receipts for jewelry purchases. $4,000? She said her earrings cost $300, fake diamonds. Real diamonds, I confirmed. A gift from Kincaid for their relationship anniversary. Noel continued leafing through the file, his face growing increasingly grim. And you knew all along. You were preparing. I wasn't sure she would decide to run away with the money, I admitted. I hoped I was wrong, but it's always better to be prepared for the worst. Noel closed the folder and looked at me, for the first time in a long time, with respect mixed with resentment. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I sighed, searching for words. You wouldn't have believed me, Noel. You would have thought I was bad-mouthing Peyton out of personal animosity, and even if you had believed me, what would you have done? You would have forgiven her. Given her a second chance, and she would have been more careful, but she would have left anyway, just more prepared. He wanted to argue, but then he slowly nodded, acknowledging that I was right. Yeah, I probably would have forgiven her. He ran his hand through his hair. God, I'm such a naive idiot. Not an idiot, just too much like your mother. I sat back down in the chair. Beverly always saw the best in people too, even when it wasn't there. And you always prepare for the worst, Noel remarked. And I'm usually right, I shrugged, especially when it comes to money and relationships. We were silent for a moment. Outside the window, dawn had broken, and the sun began to flood the room with its merciless desert light. So what now? Noel finally asked. Do we go to court? To the police? I shook my head. Courts are long, expensive, and public. And the police, well, they'll do everything they can, but when the money's already in the Caymans, the chances of getting it back through official channels are practically zero. Then what? His voice sounded desperate. Have I just lost everything? The house I'm still paying off? My savings? Even my mother's inheritance? I didn't say we weren't going to do anything, I interrupted him. I said we weren't going to go through official channels. At least not right away. Noel tensed up. What are you planning? I smiled. Not warmly, but the way I smiled when closing a difficult deal or beating a competitor. Remember when I said, start the plan on the phone? I've been working on this plan for the last few weeks. Ever since Lenny told me that Peyton and Kincaid had booked tickets to the Cayman Islands. I thought you were just, I don't know, being dramatic. Noel shook his head. I never exaggerate, son, especially when it comes to $300,000 in your future. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the desert stretching beyond the house. The sunrise painted the sand golden blood red, a beautiful but merciless sight. The plan has several parts, and the first part is already in motion. I turned to my son. Lenny and his team are tracking Peyton and Kincaid. Right now, they're at a motel on the outskirts of Las Vegas. Tomorrow, they have a flight to the Caymans. Noel's eyes widened. How do you know? Because I'm always 3 steps ahead of people like them. I allowed myself a subtle smile. Peyton has a tracking app on her phone. She thinks it's just a fitness tracker you installed for her last year. Noel frowned. But I didn't install anything. No, you didn't. Lenny did when he accidentally bumped into her at the mall and helped carry her groceries to the car. Very convenient. Her phone was in the purse he kindly held while she opened the trunk. My son looked at me with a mixture of shock and admiration. Is that legal? Absolutely not, I shrugged. But it's effective. And now is not the time to worry about legalities. They stole your money, Noel. Everything you had. He paused, then nodded as if making a decision. What now? What's the plan? I returned to my seat and leaned forward, looking my son straight in the eye. We're going to Las Vegas. Today. Right now, I paused. And we're getting your money back. Every last cent. How? His voice was doubtful. They won't just give it back. No, they won't, I agreed. But we have something they don't. What? I smiled coldly and confidently. Leverage, son. Very serious leverage. We left Palm Desert in my old Cadillac an hour after our conversation. Noel wanted to take his car, but I insisted on mine. First, my Cadillac, though old, was more reliable than his Japanese compact. Second, I wanted to drive myself. Controlling the situation starts with controlling the vehicle. And third, there were things in the trunk of my car that might come in handy. The desert stretched out endlessly outside the window, ruthless and beautiful at the same time. Noel sat staring into space, lost in his thoughts. I didn't disturb him. Everyone has their own way of coming to terms with betrayal, and he needed to go through it on his own. Finally, when we got on the highway, I broke the silence. Call your boss. Tell him you're taking a few days off. Family circumstances. Noel flinched, as if awakening from a trance. Do you think it will take that long? Better to have a buffer than to have to explain why you disappeared without warning, I replied, keeping my eyes on the road. And turn off your regular phone. Use this one. I handed him a simple push-button phone. One of those old models that are difficult to track and last longer than modern smartphones. Why? He asked, turning the phone over in his hands, puzzled. Because your smartphone can be tracked. And right now, we need to be ghosts, Noel snorted. You sound like a character in a spy movie, Dad. I sound like a man who has spent 40 years in business and knows that sometimes you have to act outside the textbook, I replied. Call him. He obeyed. The conversation with his boss was short and awkward. Noel had never been good at lying. But in this case, his confusion and dejection worked in our favor. He really sounded like a man facing a family crisis. After the call, Noel turned off his smartphone and put it in the glove compartment. Then he turned to me. Now tell me more about the plan. What exactly are we going to do? I took my eyes off the road for a moment to look at him. In my son's eyes, I saw determination mixed with uncertainty. He was ready to follow me, but he didn't understand where we were going. Typical Noel, he always needed a map and directions. First, we'll meet with Lenny in Las Vegas. He'll give us the latest information on Peyton and Kincaid's whereabouts, as well as some documents. I paused. Then we'll find them and conduct negotiations. Negotiations? Noel's voice was doubtful. What can we offer them? They've already taken all my money. Not everything in this world is measured in money, son. I allowed myself a subtle smile. Sometimes people need freedom, or a clean reputation, or no problems with the law. Are you going to blackmail them? Now there was surprise mixed with disapproval in his voice. I prefer the term leverage, I corrected him. And yes, we use everything we have. Kincaid is a crook with a criminal past. One call to the police, and his new life will be over. And Peyton, well, she's an accomplice in the theft of a large sum of money. That's also a crime. Noel fell silent, pondering my words. I knew what he was thinking. All his life he had tried to do the right thing, to play by the rules, and now his father was asking him to act outside the law. It's illegal, he finally said. So was what they did to you, I countered. Sometimes you have to choose between legality and justice. Noel fell silent again. I didn't press him. Everyone has to decide for themselves where their moral boundaries lie. Half an hour later, my phone rang. It was Lenny. I put it on speaker. Irwin, Lenny's voice sounded tense. There's been a change of plan. The Lovebirds have decided not to wait until tomorrow. They're leaving the motel in an hour. Looks like they booked an earlier flight. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Where are they headed? Las Vegas Airport. Flight at 5:30 p.m. to Miami, then on to the Caymans. I looked at my watch, 11 a.m. We had less time than I had expected. We won't make it, I said. Meet us at the motel. We'll intercept them before they leave. It's risky, Lenny replied. This is a public place. There are witnesses. We'll think of something, I said. We'll be there in 2 hours. Keep your eyes on them. I hung up and looked at Noel. Plans have changed. We'll have to move faster. He nodded, and I noticed how his face had changed. Determination had replaced doubt. Maybe there was more of me in him than I thought. I pressed the gas pedal, and the Cadillac surged forward, cutting through the desert air. A confrontation awaited us, and I wanted to be fully prepared for it. On the way, I told Noel more about what Lenny had learned during his surveillance. Peyton and Kincaid had been seeing each other for 14 months, much longer than Noel had thought. Their romance began at the clinic where Peyton worked. Kincaid, as a financial advisor, often visited the clinic to advise some of the doctors on investment matters. At some point, he began to pay special attention to the administrator, Peyton. A classic scheme for seducing a married woman, I explained as we sped down the highway. Noel listened with a stony face. And she fell for it easily? I shrugged. According to Lenny's observations, she was more than ready. Kincaid simply gave her what she was missing: thrill, a sense of risk, and of course the attention of a man who seemed to her to be a successful financier. I gave her everything she wanted, Noel said hollowly. Except the adrenaline rush of the forbidden, I remarked. Some women need that more than stability and honesty. About 6 months into the affair, Kincaid started mentioning opportunities abroad, places where money could be invested with greater returns and lower taxes. The hints became more and more transparent until he finally offered Peyton a new life: escape, money, an exotic island. And she agreed so easily, Noel asked. Just to leave everything. Leave me? Not right away, I shook my head. Lenny intercepted several of their messages. She hesitated for almost a month. She talked about feeling guilty, but Kincaid was persistent. And in the end, she agreed. Noel smiled bitterly. How generous of her, a whole month of hesitation. What about the money? Noel asked after a pause. How did they manage to empty the account so quickly? It was a planned operation, I explained. Over the past 2 months, Peyton gradually gained access to all your accounts. Remember you mentioned that the bank called about changing your password? Noel nodded. She said it was her, that she had accidentally tried to log into the app and forgotten her password. And you believed her, he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Of course I believed her. She's my wife. Was my wife, he grimaced. So she methodically collected all the necessary data. And yesterday, while you were at work, she made a series of transfers. Some to cryptocurrency wallets, some to accounts of shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Accounts that Kincaid had set up. And they can't be traced. Noel's voice was filled with despair. It's difficult, but not impossible, I smiled, especially when you have a friend like Lenny who used to work in financial intelligence. We entered the suburbs of Las Vegas. Cheap motels, gas stations, and diners lined the road. A dreary landscape for those who couldn't afford the glitz of the central casinos. My phone vibrated. A message from Lenny. Sand Dune Motel, room 23. Still here, hurry up. 10 minutes later, we pulled up to a shabby 2-story building with a neon sign. The parking lot was half empty. A few beat-up cars and one brand-new Lexus that clearly stood out from the rest. That's their car, I nodded toward the Lexus. Rented, judging by the sticker. I parked in the far corner of the lot. Lenny approached us from the shade of the awning opposite, a stocky man in a worn leather jacket with receding hair and piercing eyes. Irwin? He nodded briefly to me, then turned to Noel. You must be the son. My condolences on your situation. Noel nodded, not knowing what to say. Lenny turned to me. They're still packing. Kincaid came out 10 minutes ago, loading suitcases into the car. Then he came back to the room. Did you talk to them? I asked. No, Lenny shook his head, but I planted a bug in their car while Kincaid was in the room, and I accidentally punctured a tire. Very discreet, slow air leak, I smiled. Lenny had always been resourceful. Excellent. That means we have a little time. Noel shifted nervously from foot to foot. So what now? Are we just going to knock on the door? Exactly, I nodded. But first, let's get ready. I opened the trunk of the Cadillac and took out a small briefcase. Inside were 3 sets of documents that I had prepared with the help of Helen Waverly. A fake prenuptial agreement with Peyton's signature, a police report of fraud, documents about Kincaid's criminal past. These are our trump card, I said, showing the documents to Noel. We'll give them a choice. Either they return the money and we part ways amicably, or these documents are sent to the appropriate authorities. What if they don't agree? Noel asked. They will, I said confidently. Kincaid won't want to go back to prison, and Peyton values his reputation too much to risk a scandal. I turned to Lenny. Are you with us? He shook his head. I'd rather stay here and cover your backs. If something goes wrong, I'll be your backup plan. Are you ready? I asked Noel. He took a deep breath and nodded. I'm ready. We headed for room 23. I could feel Noel tensing with every step. His fists were clenched, his jaw muscles twitching. I put my hand on his shoulder. Stay calm. Anger is a bad advisor in negotiations. I knocked on the door. 3 confident knocks. There was a commotion inside, then muffled voices. The door opened slightly and Peyton's face appeared in the crack. Her eyes widened in shock. Noel? Her voice trembled. Then she noticed me. Erwin, what are you doing here? We came to talk, Peyton, I said calmly, about the money you took. And your companion. I don't understand what you're talking about. She tried to close the door, but I blocked it with my foot. I think you do. And I think we'd better discuss this inside. Without witnesses, a man appeared behind her. Tall, dark-haired, with that particular self-assurance in his posture that con artists have. What's going on, honey? He asked, then saw us. Who's that? That's my husband, Peyton replied quietly, and his father. Kincaid, for that was who he was, froze for a moment. Then his face took on a professionally polite expression. Look, I don't know what Peyton has told you, but this is just a business trip, he began. Stop it, Reuben, Peyton interrupted him. They know. We know much more than you think, Mr. Kowalski, I added, deliberately using his real surname. Now he turned pale too. After a moment's hesitation, Kincaid stepped back into the room, letting us in. The room was small and shabby, with a double bed covered with half-packed suitcases. On the nightstand was an open bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. They were celebrating their successful escape. Noel looked at Peyton as if he were seeing her for the first time. Why? Was all he could say. Peyton lowered her eyes, unable to meet his gaze. Noel, she faltered. It's hard to explain. Try. His voice was colder than I had ever heard it. She looked up and I saw not remorse, but irritation in her eyes. You want the truth? Fine, I'm tired, Noel. Tired of predictability. Of every day being the same as the last. Of your correctness, she practically spat out the last word. You never take risks, never do anything spontaneous. Noel looked as if he had been slapped. I saw his hands clench into fists. And that's why you stole my money? My mother's money. His voice trembled with restrained anger. It was our money, Peyton countered. I had as much right to it as you did. $300,000? Noel shook his head. That's not our money, Peyton. That's theft. Kincaid, who had been silently watching the exchange, decided to intervene. Look, I understand you're upset, but what's done is done. The money has already been transferred and there's no way to get it back. I laughed, interrupting him. Mr. Kowalski, do you really think we came here to beg for charity? I took a folder with documents out of my jacket's inside pocket. Here are some interesting papers. For example, a police report of credit card fraud and a request to reopen the investigation into document forgery in Nevada. Kincaid turned even paler. We have something interesting for you, too. I turned to Peyton. For example, this prenuptial agreement with your signature, dated the day of your wedding. According to it, in the event of infidelity, you are not entitled to any property. I never signed that, Peyton protested. Really? I raised an eyebrow. The handwriting analysis says otherwise. Of course, you can challenge this in court, which will be very public. Peyton turned pale. I knew her weak spot. She always cared about her reputation. What do you want? She asked quietly. It's very simple, I replied. You return the money, all $300,000, and we part ways amicably. No police reports, no courts, no gossip. Kincaid and Peyton exchanged glances. I could see the options running through their minds. What if we refuse? Kincaid finally asked, trying to maintain what little dignity he had left. Then in an hour, these documents will be in the hands of the police, I replied calmly. Noel, who had been listening silently until then, suddenly took a step forward, his face contorted with anger. You! He pointed his finger at Peyton. You destroyed everything we had. 5 years. For 5 years I believed you, trusted you. He turned sharply to Kincaid and, before anyone could react, punched him square in the jaw. Kincaid flew backward, crashing into the wall, and slid to the floor, clutching his face. Noel! Peyton cried, rushing to Kincaid. I grabbed my son by the shoulder, pulling him back. Enough! This won't help. Noel was breathing heavily, his eyes burning with rage. That bastard stole my wife, my money, my life. And he'll pay for it, I said firmly, but not like this. We sat in a cafe across the street from the Sand Dune Motel. We chose a table in the corner, away from the windows. Privacy was more important than the view in this case. Kincaid and Peyton sat across from us, like naughty children in front of their strict parents. Only this was no child's misdemeanor. The theft of $300,000 was a serious offense. After the incident in the room, I insisted on a change of scenery. The motel room was too cramped, too personal for our negotiations. Besides, I didn't want Noel to lose his temper again. In the cafe, under the gaze of strangers, all the participants in our little drama were forced to maintain a semblance of civility. Lenny sat at the next table pretending to read the newspaper. His role was simple: to observe and intervene if something went wrong. Although I didn't expect any problems, Kincaid was too scared, and Peyton valued her reputation too much to cause a scene. So, I put the folder with the documents on the table. Let's discuss the terms of our agreement. Kincaid, still holding his jaw, which was starting to swell after Noel's punch, tried to look businesslike. I already told you that it will take time to get the money back. The funds passed through several accounts, and some of it was converted into cryptocurrency. Don't try to fool us, Mr. Kowalski. I deliberately used his real surname, causing him to react nervously every time. Lenny tracked all your transfers. We know exactly where the money is. All $300,000. Noel sat silently, staring at his cup of coffee, which he hadn't touched. His anger had subsided a little, but I could see him clenching his fists under the table every time he looked at Peyton. Even if you somehow track the transfers, Peyton interjected, you can't prove that the money isn't mine. Noel and I were married. We had joint accounts. I smiled and opened the folder. That's where you're wrong, dear sister-in-law. Or more accurately, soon-to-be sister-in-law. I took the first document out of the folder. Do you recognize your signature? Peyton stared at the paper, frowning. What is this? It's a power of attorney, I explained. You signed it 3 months ago when Noel asked you to sign some papers for the insurance company. Remember? Her face stretched in surprise. But there was something about home insurance. There was, I confirmed, on the first page, and on the second, which you didn't bother to read, was a power of attorney giving Noel the right to act on your behalf in financial matters. I took out the second document, and this is a statement to the bank, signed by you, requesting that all transfers from your accounts be frozen in case of suspicious activity. It's dated yesterday. I never signed, Peyton began, but I interrupted her. Formally, no, but according to the power of attorney, Noel had the right to sign it for you. I paused, which he did, or rather, which Helen Waverly, the lawyer acting on his behalf, did. Peyton turned pale. Kincaid looked as if he had swallowed something sour. That's forgery, Peyton hissed. It's illegal. Maybe, I shrugged, but it will be difficult to prove, especially given your situation. Stolen money, running away with your lover? Who's going to believe you didn't sign those documents voluntarily? I looked at Noel, who finally looked up from his cup. His expression was one of surprise. He didn't know about the power of attorney. Of course he didn't. I hadn't let him in on the details of the plan, fearing that his moral principles might get in the way. What's more, I continued, the banks have already begun the process of revoking the transfers. The money you managed to convert into cryptocurrency is more difficult to trace, but the exchange you used to do so cooperates with the authorities in cases of financial fraud. Kincaid tensed up. Which exchange are you talking about? The one you used to convert $130,000 into bitcoins, I smiled. Lenny is very good at his job, Mr. Kowalski. He tracked every cent. Peyton turned to Kincaid, her face showing confusion. Reuben, you said no one could trace these transfers. And no one could, Kincaid snapped. If your damn father-in-law hadn't hired a private investigator. I watched with satisfaction as the rift in their relationship began to widen. That's exactly what I was counting on. When people join forces for money, they quickly start blaming each other when the money is threatened. We're getting off topic, I remarked. Let's get back to our agreement. You return the money, all $300,000. In exchange, we won't go to the police or disclose certain details of your past, Mr. Kowalski. Kincaid nervously licked his lips. What if I say that some of the money has already been spent? Then you'll compensate for it out of your own pocket, I replied coldly. I know about your accounts at Barclays Bank in the Cayman Islands. There's enough there to cover the shortfall. His eyes widened in shock. How did you? I told you, Lenny is very good at his job. I allowed myself a slight smile. Now let's get down to the details. You will sign an agreement to return the funds. The entire amount must be returned within 48 hours. After that, you will both disappear from my son's life. Forever. Peyton looked like she was about to cry, but I saw anger and disappointment in her eyes, not remorse. Her plan was falling apart. What do I get in return? She asked suddenly. Half of that money is rightfully mine. Noel and I were married for 5 years. Noel, who had been silent until then, raised his head sharply. Are you serious, Peyton? After everything you've done, you still dare to talk about rights? His voice sounded genuinely astonished. I understood his feelings. For someone like Noel, who had always played by the rules, such audacity was incomprehensible. We both know your father is bluffing, Peyton turned to me. This prenuptial agreement is a forgery, and so is the power of attorney. It will all fall apart in court. Maybe, I shrugged. But are you willing to take that risk? A public scandal, your name in the papers, your reputation ruined, not to mention a possible prison sentence for financial fraud. Peyton hesitated. I knew her weak spot. She always cared about what others thought of her. Status and reputation were more important to her than money. What do I get if I agree? She finally asked. A clean divorce, I replied. No charges, no publicity. You can start a new life somewhere else. Without Noel's money, of course. Kincaid, who had been sitting dejectedly until then, suddenly sat up straight. What if I can offer you something more than just a refund? He looked at me with a calculating gleam in his eyes. Information that could be valuable to you. I raised an eyebrow. What kind of information? About your competitors. Kincaid leaned forward. I've advised several major players in the construction business. I know their weaknesses, their plans, I laughed. Mr. Kowalski, I sold my company 5 years ago. I'm no longer interested in the intrigues of the construction business. But your son is, Kincaid countered. He works in that field, doesn't he? Noel tensed. I don't need dirty secrets to succeed in my work, he said contemptuously. Noble, Kincaid curled his lips, but not very practical. In this world, those who have information win. In this world, those who don't steal from their loved ones win, Noel retorted. I looked at my son in surprise. There was a harshness in his voice that I hadn't noticed before. Perhaps this painful experience was beginning to change him after all. Enough bargaining, I steered the conversation back on track. The terms are not negotiable. You return the money, every last cent. In return, you get freedom from prosecution. I took another document out of the folder and placed it in front of them. Here's the agreement. Sign it. Kincaid took the paper and began to read. His face grew darker with every line. It says here that we have to return the money within 24 hours, he looked up. You just said 48. I changed my mind, I replied coldly. 24 hours. Starting now, Peyton looked like she was ready to kill me. Kincaid continued to study the document. What's this? He pointed to one of the clauses. The parties agree not to contact Noel Hope, his family, or anyone associated with him for an indefinite period of time. That's practically a lifetime ban on communication. Exactly, I confirmed. You disappear from our lives. Forever, Peyton finally couldn't take it anymore. That's not fair. You can't just erase 5 years of my life. You erased them yourself, Noel replied quietly, looking her straight in the eye. The moment you decided to steal our money and run away? Peyton looked away, unable to withstand his direct gaze. I could see her struggling with herself. Pride versus practicality. Finally, practicality won out. Fine, she exhaled. We'll pay the money back. But I need something to start over with. You have your salary, Noel replied. And the $10,000 you withdrew from your personal account 2 weeks ago. That's enough. I looked at my son in surprise. He knew about the withdrawal? But how? I hadn't mentioned it. I'm not as blind as you think I am, Noel said, as if reading my mind. I noticed the money was gone from her account. I just didn't think much of it. I figured she bought a gift or something. At that moment, I felt a pang of regret. Perhaps Noel wasn't as naive as I thought. Perhaps he simply chose to trust, even when he had reason to doubt. There was a strength in that which I, with my eternal cynicism, didn't always appreciate. Kincaid sighed and picked up the pen I had placed next to the agreement. Let's get this over with, he said, signing the document. Peyton hesitated for a few more seconds, then signed as well. Her signature was sharp and angular, reflecting her inner state. Now for the details, I took the agreement and put it in a folder. You both will immediately begin the process of returning the money. Lenny will be watching your every move. If you try to cheat or run away, the consequences will be unpleasant. How are we going to do that? Kincaid asked. The banks are closed until morning. There's such a thing as online banking, Mr. Kowalski, I smiled. Start by canceling your flight to the Cayman Islands and getting a refund for your tickets. Then transfer the funds from your secret account back to Noel's account. Convert the cryptocurrency back to dollars. You have 24 hours. The clock is ticking. Kincaid and Peyton exchanged glances. I saw something flash in their eyes, perhaps a last thought of resistance. But the moment passed quickly. They were cornered, and they knew it. Do we have a choice? Peyton asked bitterly. There's always a choice, I replied. Just some are worse than others. We got up from the table. Lenny also stood up, ready to follow Kincaid and Peyton to make sure they kept their end of the bargain. When we got to the parking lot, Noel finally asked the question I knew had been bothering him all this time. Why didn't you tell me about the power of attorney? And all these documents? I looked at my son. His eyes showed a mixture of admiration and reproach. Because you wouldn't have agreed, I replied honestly. You would have said it was wrong, unfair, maybe even illegal, and you would have been right. But sometimes to beat the wolves, you have to become a wolf yourself. Noel thought about my words. So all these documents, are they real? The signatures, the power of attorney? I smiled. Real enough to scare them, and that's all that was needed. But what if they weren't scared? What if they demanded proof? I had a backup plan, I shrugged. I always have a backup plan, son. That's how I've survived in this business for 40 years. We got into the Cadillac. Through the windshield, I could see Lenny escorting Peyton and Kincaid back to their room. They looked deflated, like balloons that had been let out of. What now? Noel asked, looking at his ex-wife and her lover. Do we just wait for them to return the money? Exactly, I said, starting the engine. Lenny will oversee the process. In the meantime, we'll find a decent hotel and get some rest. It's been a long day. What if they try to run away? I smiled. They won't. Kincaid is too scared, and Peyton values his reputation too much. Besides, I nodded toward their car. Their Lexus has a flat tire, remember? And Lenny disabled the spare tire while we were talking. Noel shook his head, something like a smile flitting across his face. The first in this whole crazy day. You really thought this through, didn't you? Always, son. Always. We left the motel parking lot and headed toward downtown Las Vegas, where we could find a decent hotel. On the way, I thought about how Noel had changed in the last 24 hours. The shock and pain were still there, but there was something new in his eyes. Toughness, determination. He was beginning to understand how the real world worked. A world where the person who plays fair doesn't always win. It was a painful lesson, but a necessary one. I always knew that sooner or later, Noel would have to learn it. It's just a shame that it cost him his marriage and his faith in people. But perhaps it wasn't such a high price to pay to become stronger. To learn how to defend yourself in a world where predators are always looking for easy prey. You know, Noel said, looking out the window at the neon lights of Las Vegas appearing on the horizon. I always thought that your suspicion, your constant readiness for the worst was a flaw, that you were too cynical, that you didn't believe in people enough. He turned to me and I saw understanding in his eyes. But now I see that you were right. All this time you were right. I said nothing. What could I say? That sometimes I regretted my cynicism? That I envied his ability to see the good in people, even when they deceived him? That deep down I wished I were wrong in my gloomy predictions? Instead, I just nodded and focused on the road. Another day of struggle awaited us. For money, for justice, for Noel's future. And I was ready for this struggle as I had been ready my whole life. Because in this world, it's not the strongest or the smartest who survive. It's those who are best prepared. The morning in Las Vegas greeted us with relentless sun and a call from Lenny. We stayed at a decent hotel on the Strip. Not the most expensive, but not one of those where the sheets are changed once a month. I insisted on 2 rooms. Noel needed space to digest everything that had happened. The phone rang at exactly 7 in the morning. I always wake up early, so I had already taken a shower and ordered coffee to the room. "Erwin," Lenny's voice sounded tense. "We have a problem." I was instantly alert. "What is it?" "Our lovebirds tried to escape during the night. They called a taxi to get to the bus station. And I intercepted them." Lenny's voice sounded satisfied. "I noticed them in time and convinced the taxi driver that they were feeling ill and it would be better to cancel the trip. They tried to run off with the money." I began to get annoyed. Did they really think they could cheat us? "Not exactly," Lenny chuckled. "They've already started the process of returning the money, as we agreed. They canceled their tickets to the Caymans and returned about $50,000 to Noel's account. But then apparently they decided it would be better to disappear before it was too late." I sighed deeply. Typical behavior for people like them. First, they make a gesture of goodwill to lull you into a false sense of security, and then they try to slip away. "Where are they now?" "In their room." Under my supervision, Lenny's voice took on a steely tone. I explained that the next attempt to escape would have more serious consequences. "Okay," I glanced at my watch. "We'll be there in an hour. Keep an eye on them." I hung up and headed for Noel's room. I knocked 3 times and, without waiting for a response, entered. My son was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring into space. Judging by his rumpled clothes and red eyes, he hadn't gone to bed. "Have you been up all night?" I asked, even though the answer was obvious. Noel looked up at me wearily. "I couldn't sleep." I kept going over it in my head. Our meeting with Peyton, her words, her face. I was trying to figure out when exactly it all went wrong. I sat down next to him. I wanted to put my hand on his shoulder, but something stopped me. Perhaps it was the fear that such a gesture might seem condescending. "It's a pointless exercise, son. When the house burns down, there's no point in figuring out which spark caused the fire." "But I have to understand," he said, his voice filled with despair. "I have to understand so I don't make the same mistake again." "Your only mistake was trusting too much," I replied bluntly. "You saw only the good in people, even when they showed their true colors?" Noel smiled bitterly. "Like Mom, huh? She always trusted people too." "Yes," I nodded. "But your mother had an advantage. Me. I saw those who tried to take advantage of her and protected her. You didn't have that protection." "Because I pushed you away," Noel shook his head. "I thought you were too cynical, too suspicious. I thought I knew life better." I said nothing. There was no point in rubbing salt in the wound by stating the obvious. "We have a problem," I said instead. "Peyton and Kincaid tried to escape last night." Noel's head snapped up, anger flashing in his eyes. "What? After everything we discussed?" "Lenny stopped them," I reassured my son. "But it shows how unreliable they are. We need to go there and personally oversee the return of the money." Noel stood up, his movements sharp and purposeful. "Give me 10 minutes to take a shower." I nodded and left the room. I paused briefly in the hallway, thinking about how quickly my son was changing. Yesterday he was devastated. Today he was seething with anger. It was progress, albeit painful. 40 minutes later, we were in the car, heading back to the Sand Dune Motel. Noel sat silently, his face hard and determined. Only occasionally did I notice his hands clenching into fists, a sign of inner struggle. How do you feel? I finally asked, breaking the silence. Noel didn't answer for a long time, as if searching for the right words. Angry, he finally said. Not just at Peyton and that Kincaid. At myself, for being so blind. Self-flagellation won't help, I remarked. What happened has already happened. What matters is what lessons you learn from it. What lessons should I learn, Dad? His voice sounded bitter. Not to trust anyone? Always expect the worst from people? I thought about it. Did I really want my son to become as cynical as I was? Always ready for betrayal? Always keeping his distance? Not necessarily, I finally replied, but learning to be cautious, to see the signs of deception, to protect yourself. That's not cynicism. That's sensible caution. Noel nodded, but I could see he wasn't entirely convinced. You know what's strange? He said after a pause. I hardly feel any pain from losing Peyton. It's as if the person I loved never existed. Because she didn't, I said more softly than usual. You love the image she created, especially for you. The real Peyton is the one you saw yesterday. Calculating, cold, thinking only of herself. And I didn't notice the difference in 5 years. Noel shook his head. What a fool I was. Not a fool, I objected. Just a man who wanted to believe in the best. There's no shame in that. Noel looked at me in surprise. I rarely said anything so optimistic, but at that moment it seemed important to me that he not completely lose the part of himself that made him like Beverly. The ability to see the good in people, even if it sometimes led to disappointment. We pulled up to the motel and saw Lenny smoking at the entrance to room 23. He nodded to us, threw away his cigarette butt and stamped it out. They're inside, Lenny said when we approached. Not as lively as yesterday, especially after last night's adventure. Did they return any more money? I asked. Yes, they transferred another $100,000 to Noel's account this morning. They're working on returning the cryptocurrency now. It's more complicated and takes time. I nodded and looked at Noel. Ready? He took a deep breath and nodded. We entered the room. Peyton and Kincaid were sitting at a small table by the window, in front of an open laptop. They looked exhausted, with dark circles under their eyes and rumpled clothes. When we entered, Kincaid flinched, and Peyton just glanced at us briefly, then stared back at the laptop screen. How's the refund going? I asked without preamble. Kincaid cleared his throat. We've already refunded about $150,000. We're working on the rest. And your nighttime excursion? I raised an eyebrow. Was that part of the refund process too? Peyton finally looked up. Her eyes showed a mixture of fear and defiance. We just wanted a drink. There isn't even a decent bar in this dump. At 3 in the morning? With luggage? Lenny chuckled behind us. Interesting choice of time for a cocktail. Kincaid shot Peyton an annoyed look, as if reproaching her for her poor lie. Listen, he said, trying to sound businesslike. We're doing our part of the deal. The money is coming back. It just takes time. Cryptocurrency can't be converted instantly, especially amounts like this. You have, I glanced at my watch, 16 hours left before the deadline. After that, the documents will be sent to the police. We'll make it, Kincaid licked his lips nervously. We just need a little leeway. Constant surveillance only slows down the process. Mr. Kowalski, I smiled without a trace of amusement. After your nighttime escapade, you lost the right to any freedom of action. From now on, your every move will be monitored. Noel, who had been silent until then, suddenly stepped forward and looked at Peyton. Why? He asked quietly. Why did you do it? And don't give me that boring routine again. I want to know the real reason. Peyton looked taken aback. She clearly hadn't expected such a direct question, especially asked in such a calm tone. I already told you. No, Noel interrupted her. You gave me an excuse. Now I want the truth. I deserve that much. Something in his voice, in his direct gaze, silenced her. Then she sighed as if giving in. The truth is, I never wanted what we had, Noel. The house in the suburbs, the neighbors, the weekend barbecues. That life suffocated me. You could have just left, Noel remarked. Get a divorce. Why steal money? Because I wasted 5 years on you, Peyton suddenly snapped. 5 years of pretending, smiling, playing the perfect wife. I deserve compensation. I watched my son's face. Not a muscle moved, though I knew Peyton's words must have cut him like a knife. He was growing stronger right before my eyes. So, our marriage was just a job to you? Noel asked quietly. And 300,000 is your salary? Peyton looked away. You wouldn't understand. No, I understand. Noel's voice remained calm, but there was a steely edge to it. I understand that you used me, that it was all a lie. Every kiss, every I love you, every moment I thought was special. Kincaid, clearly uncomfortable with this personal conversation, tried to intervene. Maybe we should get back to business? Time is short and we need to finish the translations. But Noel ignored him, continuing to look at Peyton. And when did he show up? He nodded toward Kincaid. From the beginning. Or did you find him later, when you realized I wasn't the lottery ticket you were hoping for? Peyton flushed. That's not true, I thought. I hoped I could love you. You're a good man, Noel. It's just not rich enough, not exciting enough. Noel shook his head. You know what's ironic? If you had just asked, I would have given you the money for a fresh start, without all this betrayal. Peyton finally looked him in the eye. Really? Really, Noel confirmed. Because unlike you, I really did love you. A heavy silence hung in the room. I could see that Noel's words had affected Peyton, not because of guilt, but because of the realization of a missed opportunity. She had miscalculated, and now she understood it. We need to finish the translations, Kincaid finally said, breaking the silence. If you want to get your money on time. I nodded, returning to practical matters. Show me what you've done so far. We spent the next few hours watching the money return process. Kincaid turned out to be quite skilled at financial manipulation. Not surprising, given his past. He successfully converted the cryptocurrency back into dollars, albeit with some losses due to exchange rate fluctuations. Then he began the process of transferring funds from offshore accounts back to Noel's account. Lenny watched his every move, occasionally offering advice or pointing out mistakes. I was impressed by my old friend's professionalism. He really knew all the ins and outs of financial transactions. Peyton was mostly silent, only occasionally answering Kincaid's questions about passwords and access to her accounts. She looked lost, as if she was only now beginning to realize the consequences of her actions. Noel kept his distance, watching the process with a stony face. He intervened only once, when Kincaid suggested leaving some of the money for operating expenses. Every last cent, Noel said firmly, or there will be no deal. By evening, most of the money had been returned. About 40,000 remained, which, according to Kincaid, was stuck in the international transfer process and should be credited to Noel's account within 24 hours. That's the most we can do right now, Kincaid explained. Bank transfers between countries are not instantaneous, especially when it comes to jurisdictions like the Cayman Islands. I looked at Lenny, who nodded, confirming that Kincaid was not lying. Okay, I agreed. But until all the money's returned, our agreement is not in effect, and you two remain under observation. But we've done our part of the deal, Kincaid protested. The process is underway. The money is on its way. The process is underway, but it's not complete, I replied coldly. And after your attempt to escape last night, I'm not inclined to trust your word. Kincaid wanted to argue, but Peyton put her hand on his shoulder, stopping him. He's right, Reuben. It's our own fault. Let's just end this. Her voice sounded tired and resigned. The game was over, and she knew it. We left the room, leaving Lenny to continue the surveillance. I suggested that Noel have lunch at the cafe across from the motel, and he agreed, though without much enthusiasm. The cafe was almost empty, just a couple of truckers at the bar and an elderly couple in the far corner. We ordered coffee and sandwiches, though I doubted Noel would be able to eat anything. How are you feeling? I asked when the waitress had left. Noel was silent for a long time, as if the question had taken him by surprise. I don't know, he finally replied. Empty. It's as if everything I thought was real turned out to be a facade. And now all I see are bare walls, I nodded, understanding the feeling. Betrayal always leaves a void behind. It will pass, I said. Not right away, but it will pass. I'm not sure I want it to pass, Noel said, staring out the window at the deserted landscape. Maybe I need to remember this feeling. Like a vaccine against future mistakes. In his words, I heard an echo of my own thoughts many years ago, after my first major betrayal in business. I also wanted to keep the pain as a reminder, as protection, and in a sense I succeeded. Too well. Pain is a bad teacher, son, I said gently. It only teaches fear, and fear is not the best advisor in life. Noel looked at me in surprise. You always told me to be careful, to trust people less. Caution and fear are different things, I said, taking a sip of coffee. Caution allows you to see danger and avoid it. Fear makes you see danger everywhere, even where there is none. Noel thought about my words. I saw understanding flash in his eyes. And you? Are you afraid? The question caught me off guard with its directness. I had never admitted my fears to anyone, not even Beverly, especially my greatest fear, losing those I love. Sometimes, I replied honestly, but I try not to let fear control my decisions. Noel nodded as if my admission had helped him see something new. You know, I always thought you weren't afraid of anything, that you always knew what to do. No one always knows, son. I smiled weakly. We're all just trying to make the best decisions based on what we know. How do you know if a decision is right? You don't, I shrugged. You can only weigh the risks, calculate the consequences, and make a choice. And then live with that choice, whatever it may be. The waitress brought our order, but neither Noel nor I touched our food. We were both too engrossed in conversation. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust again, Noel admitted. Not just women. Anyone you will, I was sure of it. Because without trust, life loses its meaning. You'll just learn to trust selectively. And that's a good lesson, albeit a painful one. Do you trust people? Noel asked, looking me in the eye. A few, I replied. Your mother. You. A few old friends like Lenny. And how did you know they could be trusted? I thought about it. It was a good question, and I didn't have a ready answer. Time, I said finally. Time and trials. True friendship, true love, stands the test of time and hardship. Noel nodded, slowly starting to eat his sandwich, as if only now remembering he was hungry. What about Peyton and that Kincaid? He asked after a pause. After they return all the money? They'll disappear, I shrugged. They'll go somewhere far away from here and start a new life. Without your money, of course. Do you think they'll stay together? I smiled. I doubt it. Relationships built on deception and profit are rarely lasting. Most likely they'll run away as soon as they realize they can't get anything more from each other. Noel nodded thoughtfully. You know, it's strange, but I almost feel sorry for them. Living like that must be very lonely. I looked at my son in surprise. After everything that had happened, he could still feel compassion for those who had hurt him. In that, he was so much like Beverly. You're better than I am, son, I said quietly. And I hope you stay that way, despite this lesson. Noel was embarrassed by my words, but I could see that they touched him. Perhaps for the first time in many years, I expressed direct approval of his qualities rather than criticizing his naivety. After lunch, we returned to the motel. Lenny reported that another $15,000 had been deposited into Noel's account, and the rest should arrive by morning. They're both exhausted, Lenny added, especially her. She seems to be starting to understand what she's lost. She didn't lose it, she threw it away, Noel corrected, and in his voice I heard not bitterness, but simply a statement of fact. We decided that Lenny would stay and watch over Peyton and Kincaid, while Noel and I returned to the hotel. It had been a long day and we both needed some rest. On the way to the hotel, Noel was silent, staring out the window at the lights of the casinos and hotels passing by. Las Vegas was coming to life as evening fell, transforming into a shining mirage in the middle of the desert. We almost got the money back, Noel said finally, but I still feel robbed. Because it's not about the money, I replied. It's about the fact that you lost your faith. In people, in relationships, maybe even in yourself. Noel nodded, acknowledging the truth of my words. How do you live with that? Day by day, I said, more quietly than usual. Allowing yourself to feel the pain, but not letting it dictate your decisions. Learning from the experience, but not letting it make you cynical. How did you do it? Noel asked. After your mother died, how did you cope? The question hit a raw nerve. The truth was I hadn't coped. Not completely. I closed myself off, distanced myself from everyone, even my son. I built walls behind which I hid my pain and fear of new losses. I'm not sure I did, I admitted honestly, but I kept on living. Maybe that's the answer. Just keep going, even when it seems like you can't. 4 months later, I was sitting on the porch of my house in Palm Desert, watching the sun go down. The evening air was gradually cooling, bringing welcome relief after a hot day. I sipped whiskey on the rocks and thought about how life had changed during that time, especially Noel's life. After we returned from Las Vegas, my son spent another week with me. We didn't talk much. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts. Noel mostly sat on the porch, staring out at the desert, or wandered around the neighborhood, as if trying to drown out his inner pain with physical activity. I didn't try to talk to him. I knew he needed time to process what had happened. The money was returned in full, all $300,000. The last transfer arrived the morning after our conversation in the cafe. Lenny made sure that Peyton and Kincaid left the motel and drove away. She to the east, he to the west. They parted ways immediately after fulfilling their part of the deal. Apparently, their love couldn't withstand the test of failure. When Noel finally returned to Phoenix, I noticed a change in him. He stood straighter, spoke more sharply, and his gaze became more assessing, as if he were constantly looking for a catch. He began divorce proceedings, choosing the most aggressive lawyer from Helen Waverly's firm. It wasn't about money, there was nothing left to divide, but to protect himself as much as possible from any future claims by Peyton. In the months that followed, we communicated regularly, more often than before the story. Noel called every week and sometimes came over on weekends. I watched as new traits emerged in him: cynicism, distrust, calculation. He became more ambitious at work and less forgiving of others' mistakes. He changed his social circle. He stopped seeing the Peyton couple, as he called their mutual friends, and became closer to more successful, influential colleagues. It was my victory. What I had always wanted was for my son to become stronger, to learn to defend himself in a cruel world. So why, instead of satisfaction, did I feel a vague uneasiness? My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up. I recognized Noel's new Audi. He had replaced his small Japanese car with something more prestigious, appropriate to his position, as he put it. It was one of many small changes that together formed a new personality. He got out of the car, and I noticed more changes: an expensive suit, a fashionable haircut, the confident movements of a man who knows exactly what he wants. He was not at all like the confused, grief-stricken son who had knocked on my door 4 months ago. "Hi, Dad." Noel climbed onto the porch and shook my hand firmly. "I wasn't expecting you today." I pointed to the chair next to me. "Were you passing by?" Noel smiled as he sat down. "You could say that. I was at a meeting with potential investors in La Quinta. I thought, why not stop by?" I nodded toward the bottle of whiskey. "Care for some?" "Why not?" he said, loosening his tie. "It's been a long day." I poured him a whiskey and silently handed him the glass. We sat for a while, watching the last rays of the sun paint the desert gold and crimson. "How did the meeting go?" I finally asked. "Productive." Noel took a sip of whiskey. "They're ready to invest in my project. Not as much as I had hoped, but it's enough to get started." "Project?" I raised an eyebrow. "You didn't tell me about any project." Noel smiled. Not the open smile I remembered, but something more reserved, more calculated. "I'm leaving the company. Starting my own firm, consulting in construction and engineering." I was surprised. Noel always seemed happy with his job at a large construction corporation, valued stability in the team. "That's a big step. Are you sure you're ready?" "More than ready," Noel nodded. "Working for someone else is limiting. I want to build something of my own." On my own terms, I recognized those words, almost verbatim what I had said when I started my business 40 years ago. It was like listening to an echo from the past. "And when did you make that decision?" "It was a gradual process," Noel shrugged, "but I made the final decision after the incident with Mitchell." "Mitchell?" "I don't remember him mentioning that name." "My boss," Noel explained. "He made me take the blame for a failed project that he himself had ruined. I could have resisted, but I decided it was a good reason to leave and start my own business. I waited for the right moment, gathered evidence of his incompetence, and used it as leverage to get good references and compensation. I looked closely at my son. 6 months ago, he would have simply swallowed the injustice, or, at best, directly expressed his dissatisfaction. Now he was thinking strategically, calculating his moves, using leverage, just as I had taught him. Sounds ineffective, I said cautiously. Exactly, Noel nodded. I've learned a lot over the past few months, especially after Peyton and I tensed at the mention of her name. Did she try to contact you? Twice. Noel took another sip of whiskey. First, she sent a long letter of apology. Then she tried to call. I didn't answer. Right, I nodded approvingly. There's no point in going back to the past. It's not about the past, Noel shook his head. It's just that there's no point in wasting time on people who aren't useful. Something in that phrase made me flinch inwardly. People who aren't useful. Such a cynical, cold attitude. I often thought that way myself, but hearing it from Noel was wrong. Do you know what's going on with her now? I asked, trying to understand how deep the changes in my son had gone. I know, Noel shrugged. I asked Lenny to keep an eye on her. Just in case, I looked at him in surprise. You hired Lenny? Without me? You gave me his contact information yourself, Noel reminded me. You said he might come in handy in the future. I took his advice. I did give him Lenny's contact information, but I didn't expect my son to use a private investigator to spy on his ex-wife. And what did he find out? I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. Nothing much, Noel said, sounding uninterested. She moved to Albuquerque and got a job as an administrator at some clinic. She lives alone and doesn't make much money. Fair punishment, I think. There was no malice in his voice, just a cold satisfaction that justice had prevailed. But the lack of compassion bothered me. The old Noel, despite the pain of betrayal, would have found the strength, if not to forgive, then at least not to rejoice in other people's misfortunes. And Kincaid, I decided to continue the conversation. He's even worse off, Noel smirked. He tried to pull a scam on another client of that clinic and got caught. He's now under investigation for fraud. And that makes you happy? I watched my son's reaction closely. No, it doesn't, Noel shrugged. It just confirms what you always said. In the end, people get what they deserve. I never said such words. On the contrary, I have always believed that the world is unfair, and that is precisely why one must be prepared to defend oneself. But Noel seemed to have created his own version of my philosophy, a harsher, more cynical one. You know, son, I said cautiously, being prepared for the worst does not mean wishing it on others. Noel looked at me with slight surprise. I don't wish them harm. I just don't feel sorry that they got what they deserved. We fell silent again. The sun had completely disappeared below the horizon, and now twilight enveloped the desert. I turned on the lights on the porch, creating an island of light in the gathering darkness. I met someone, Noel said suddenly, changing the subject. A woman? I was surprised. I didn't expect him to be ready for a new relationship so soon. Lorraine Brooks, Noel nodded. She's a lawyer, works for a firm that represents one of my investors. And how long have you been seeing each other? 2 months. Noel took a sip of whiskey. But I'm not rushing into anything. I did a little research on her past, her finances, her connections. Everything's clean. I stared at my son. You check out the women you date? Of course. He looked at me like I was a naive child. After Peyton, I'm not taking any chances. It's better to know everything in advance than to get an unpleasant surprise. I didn't know how to respond. On the one hand, his caution was understandable. On the other hand, a relationship that began with scrutiny and suspicion was unlikely to become the basis for something sincere and deep. And does she know about your investigation? Of course not, Noel shook his head. That would ruin everything. Women love mysteries and secrets, don't they? There was something cynical, almost contemptuous in his voice when he spoke of women, as if they were not human beings, but some kind of alien creatures to be studied and manipulated. Relationships shouldn't start with secrets and mistrust, son, I said gently. Really? Noel raised an eyebrow. Didn't you and Mom keep some things from each other? Were you always completely honest with her? The question hit a nerve. It was true that I didn't always tell Beverly about the difficulties of the business, about some of the questionable decisions I had to make, but that was out of a desire to protect her, to spare her unnecessary anxiety. It wasn't because I didn't trust her. Your mother and I trusted each other, I said firmly, even if we sometimes kept details to ourselves. Exactly, Noel nodded, as if I had confirmed his point of view. All relationships are built on selective truth. I'm just more systematic in my approach. I realized the conversation was going nowhere. Noel had taken what he wanted from my philosophy and distorted it into something harsher, more cynical. And now he was using my own arguments against me. Listen, son, I decided to change tactics. I'm glad you've become more cautious, that you've learned to protect yourself. But don't let your experience with Peyton define your whole life. Not all people are like her. I know, Noel nodded. That's exactly why I'm doing the background check. To separate the trustworthy from the rest, I sighed. He didn't understand, or didn't want to understand. How are you doing, Dad? Noel asked, clearly wanting to change the subject. Are you still seeing that woman? What's her name? Carol, I shook my head. No, we broke up a couple of months ago. Why? Noel's voice sounded curious but not sympathetic. She wanted more than I could offer, I shrugged. It's hard to change habits at my age. In reality, Carol left because she said I was emotionally unavailable, that I kept her at a distance, not allowing her to truly get to know me. She was right, of course. After Beverly died, I didn't let anyone get too close. I was afraid of losing again. Reasonable, Noel nodded. Why risk comfort for uncertain prospects? I looked at my son with a slight sadness. He interpreted my loneliness as a conscious choice, not as a result of fear and an inability to open up again. Worst of all, he considered it the right, sensible approach. I brought you something. Noel reached into his jacket's inside pocket and pulled out an envelope. An invitation to the opening of my company. In 2 weeks, there will be a small reception for potential clients and partners. I'd like to see you there. I took the envelope. It was heavy, expensive paper, gold embossed. On the front, in elegant lettering, was written, Noel Hope, founder and CEO, Hope Strategy. Hope Strategy? I raised an eyebrow. Sounds confident, doesn't it? Noel smiled. A hint of the surname, but also a promise of hope, of solutions. Marketers say it works well. I nodded, though inwardly I cringed at such a calculated use of his own surname. The old Noel would have found it too pretentious. I'll be there, of course, I said, putting away the invitation. I'm proud of you, son. And I really was proud. Despite all the changes, despite my concerns about the kind of person he was becoming, I couldn't help but admire his determination, his ability to recover from a blow and move on. You know, I wanted to thank you, Noel said, looking at his glass, for that plan with Peyton, for opening my eyes. I just wanted to protect you, I replied honestly, to get your money back. You did much more than that. Noel looked up, his eyes shining with a strange mixture of gratitude and cold determination. You taught me the most important lesson. Always have a plan. For every situation in life, he finished his whiskey and put the glass on the table. Now I have a plan for every situation in life too, he continued. At work, in relationships, in finances. Always a backup, always insurance. Just like you taught me, I felt a strange uneasiness. Yes, I had always been a proponent of foresight, planning, and preparing for the worst, but not to the extent that it became the main principle of life, supplanting spontaneity, trust, and joy. Son, I began cautiously, planning is good, but life cannot be completely planned. Sometimes you just have to live, trust, take risks. Noel looked at me with slight surprise. It's strange to hear that from you. You always said the opposite. Maybe I wasn't entirely right, I admitted, or rather not entirely right. Caution is good, but not to the point of turning life into a constant wait for a blow. Noel was silent, pondering my words. Then he shook his head. I'm sorry, Dad, but I can't agree. Not after what happened to Peyton, not after what I've seen at work, in business. The world is cruel, and the only way to survive is to be tougher, smarter, more calculating. I looked at my son and saw myself reflected in him. the cynical, cold person I had become after Beverly's death, which, to be honest, I had been even before her death, but she had softened my rough edges and brought warmth and light into my life. And suddenly I realized what I had done. I had created a monster in my own image. I took Noel's best qualities, his openness, his ability to see the good in people, his sincerity, and methodically destroyed them, replacing them with my lessons, with my cynicism, with my distrust. I wanted to protect him, but instead I took away what made him special, what he had inherited from Beverly. Son, I tried again, don't become me. Don't make my mistakes mistakes. Noel frowned. You built a successful business, provided for your family, always stayed one step ahead of the competition. What mistakes? I lost the ability to trust, I said quietly. I lost the ability to truly love after your mother died. I lost touch with you for many years because of my stubbornness and pride. These are not victories, son. These are defeats. Noel looked at me with incomprehension, as if I were speaking a foreign language. You taught me how to survive, he said firmly. I am grateful for that. But life is more than survival. I felt desperate, trying to get through to him. It's about connections, trust, love, everything that makes us human, not just predators fighting for a place under the sun. Noel shook his head, and in his eyes I saw not anger or rejection, but something worse, condescending pity. It was as if he were looking at a naive old man who didn't understand the realities of life. I'm sorry, Dad, but I prefer your old lessons, he said softly. They seem more practical to me. He glanced at his watch and stood up. I have to go. I have to get up early tomorrow. Lots to do. I got up too, feeling heavy-hearted. We hugged, formally without any real closeness. Once, long ago, hugs with my son were filled with warmth and love. Now it was just a social ritual. See you at the opening, Noel said, heading for the door. And thanks again for everything. I watched as he got into his expensive car and drove away, taking with him a part of me, the worst part, which I had so diligently passed on to him. Standing on the porch watching the headlights recede, I felt a deep, piercing loneliness. I returned to my chair and poured myself another whiskey. Night fell on the desert, covering it with a dark veil. The stars twinkled coldly and distantly, like Noel's eyes when he talked about his plan for every situation in life. I had created a monster in my own image and likeness, and now it was too late to change anything.